Another topic I want to bring back up here at the end of the course is just the issue of preaching the Gospels and preaching from the Gospels. And in earlier version of this class, before I wrote the Reading Gospels Wisely so many years ago now, I had various readings that I assigned for this, and obviously I thought that maybe none of them ultimately did it well enough, and so I wrote my own sort of chapter on that. And so most of what I would want to say about how to read and preach from the Gospels is already in Reading Gospels Wisely. But as I've continued to think about this over the years, there are other things I can recommend on reading, but also I just wanted to throw out a few thoughts and also mostly encourage you to, in fact, preach from the Gospels and try to give you some encouragement and help to do that. And some years ago, I was on a panel at the Gospel Coalition, and we were talking about preaching from the Gospels, and it just stimulated some thoughts. So I just kind of have some bullet points here to walk through things that are particularly pitfalls in preaching narratives, things that can go wrong pretty badly in preaching narratives, so just to throw a few of these out for you. First, one pitfall of preaching narratives like the Gospels would be using an overly atomistic approach, maybe what you'd find in the epistles, and that is, again, walking through in a kind of verse-by-verse way. And I think you've seen now, I hope in this course, that the way the Gospels communicate is not in a verse-by-verse way of sort of read this verse and then apply it, read this verse, then apply it. That's not even really a good way to do the epistles either, I'd suggest, but it's certainly not a good way to preach from the Gospels. Also related is another pitfall is drawing out minor details of the story and sort of making them just sort of easy points of application. I'm not saying that can never be done, but the point is first hear the story as it is told. First hear the story as it is a narrative and focus on that as your emphasis. Also, tackling too small of chunks of narrative, either a tiny part of a story or even reading a story without being sensitive to how it fits into its broader context is a very common mistake when it comes to preaching narrative. Or shrink drying them into their doctrinal only content. That's another pitfall, kind of using a story as just a husk to pull off to get to the doctrine only. It's true that stories do teach us, but they are always embodied in the form of a story, which has a power that is more than just the point they're trying to make. And also a merely moralistic reading. Now, as you know from this course, I've really emphasized that we should be reading the Gospels for formation. We should be reading them for ethical and moral instruction and for how to be in the world. But they're not only that, and if we read them in a way that is purely moralistic, we'll lose the bigger picture of the Gospels, which is a message of God's grace by the Spirit. Certainly is one thing we could do. And one final thing to say, a potential pitfall of reading the Gospels or preaching the Gospels in a certain way, is focusing, I think, too much on backgrounds and behind the text material as if that's determinative of what the text means. Again, I've emphasized that it's helpful to understand history, but at the same time, the way stories work is not by using them and then kind of packing them in with all this kind of information of these great insights you have from history. That has a kind of appeal in preaching that people will think, wow, this person's really smart and knows a lot of things. But the best thing you can do when preaching the Gospels is pay attention to how the story works and model for your hearers and readers how to read the Gospels themselves, how to read them carefully and sensitively to the story in its context and broader context, and how to hear what God is saying rather than you becoming this expert that has all this magical outside information that supposedly makes sense of a story. The Gospels do exist in history and they matter, but they exist primarily as stories given to us in the canon. And that's your first focus as you think about preaching from the Gospels. So again, more that could be said about this. Things I say in Reading Gospels Wisely, certainly other things we could talk about in other formats. The main thing I want you to get from this is don't be afraid, get out there and preach from the Gospels.